What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Today, I am joined by Bryan Boorstein from Evolved Training Systems. Bryan, how you doing, my man?
I'm doing great. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on here. Just so everyone knows, I've spoken to you offline about how impressed I am with the way that you ask questions and the way you elicit responses from your guests. So I'm just honestly really honored to be here with you.
Yeah, man, it's my pleasure, and I appreciate the kind words. Bryan and I have gotten into some pretty interesting discussions about training on social media recently, and for that reason, I was like, "Hey, man, I think I need to get you on the show." When it comes to the Muscle Memoirs podcast, we do pride ourselves in the fact that we take an evidence-based approach to fitness, and as we know, evidence-based comprises multiple areas. So we have successful athletes looking at the practices of those individuals. We have successful coaches in the trenches. And then we also have researchers, nutrition and exercise science, professors, those who are in the laboratory conducting studies and answering some of these questions. Bryan has an extensive history of coaching. He himself is an athlete. He's jacked. He makes other people jacked. He's a very intelligent guy, and for that reason, I had to get him on. Now, for our conversation today, we're going to be mixing things up a little bit, and by that I mean we don't have a specific topic to discuss per se. The general realm is practical programming strategies for muscle hypertrophy, and Bryan put out a question on social media, said this is the general topic of discussion for the podcast. Give me your questions and we'll give you some answers. And Bryan got a wide variety of some spectacular questions, some very nuanced questions, which we appreciate on the Muscle Memoirs. So hopefully we can provide those contextual answers to get our listeners closer, get them those couple extra percentage points to optimize their hypertrophy training. With that being said, let's dive into question one. So, Bryan, our first question is, if I find I have a lagging body part, such as my glutes and hamstrings, is it okay to add in an extra day to focus on that body part? Can I just increase volume and or frequency for that muscle group? It's a little specific, but we can get into a nice discussion here about specialization phases for muscle hypertrophy. So, Bryan, if we want to bring up a lagging body part, what's the best approach we should be taking?
Yeah, totally. The question was kind of phrased in the manner of like assuming that just by adding extra volume and or frequency, that would be sufficient for them to continue to grow their glutes and their hamstrings as a specialization muscle group. And I think the first thing that needs to be stated in regards to this is that, we do have that theoretical glass of water that is our volume that we can tolerate. And if we're currently training around what is maximally adaptive for us or closing in on what our MRV might be, just going and adding additional volume isn't going to be a good idea. So I think the first thing to kind of understand with this is that maintenance volume is so low. And we've established this numerous times. I've heard it numerous times on this podcast as well. So, about a third or so of what it takes for you to gain, you can maintain. So if we look at this individual and we assume that they're currently working at, call it 18 sets per muscle group per week, then they could easily take a couple of their stronger muscle groups or those that they're not as concerned about growing at the moment, reduce those down to say 6, maybe 8, even 10 sets. And now we've freed up a ton of volume that we can apply to the glutes and the hamstrings. So I think that's definitely point number one. And then I think another consideration kind of on the forefront of my brain is choosing movements that aren't going to cause an excessive amount of fatigue. Like if I'm replacing a chest movement or a bicep movement with a hip hinge and barbell hip thrusts or something like that, that doesn't seem like an even trade. The fatigue cost is going to be significantly higher on the glute and hamstring work. So I think with those two considerations in mind, you can then kind of begin to delve into and look at kind of splitting up frequency, adding volume, et cetera, et cetera.
Awesome. I think you make an excellent point there in first considering where is your volume at? What does your progress look like? Because, we might think, oh, we should add volume and frequency to bring up a lagging muscle group. But do you have the available resources to be able to actually benefit from that practice? And you might very well not. You might be maxing out your volume systemically. And as we know, right, stress is stress is stress. If if it's finals week and you're a student, if you have increased workload at your job and you're stressed out, that's going to affect your ability to recover in the gym. So, if we look at just training, as you mentioned, we can take work away from other muscle groups in order to free up more resources to increase our volume and or our frequency for one specific muscle group, which I think is really important. As we dive into the glutes and hamstrings specifically, I think this can get into a potentially interesting discussion about the nuances, and that is because these muscle groups in particular, the best movements for them tend to be pretty disruptive and can be difficult to recover from. So what immediately comes to my mind if we're looking at bread and butter movements for glutes are going to be things like hip dominant leg presses or squats. We're going to be looking at hip hinges, maybe a banded RDL, and we also have our unilateral split squats, lunge patterns. And for our listeners who are experienced resistance trainees, they know that these movements will absolutely mess you up. It can be difficult to recover from. I know personally, if I haven't done lunges in a while, give me two sets of 12 like an RP6 and it still hurts to sit down the next day. And with this information in mind, I kind of want to pose a question to you here, Bryan, and that is when people design a specialization phase, they're increasing volume and they're increasing frequency, and some movements are more difficult to recover from than others. Is it really worthwhile to increase our training frequency if we're just going to be adding in movements that really aren't that effective, but we can recover from them? For example, maybe if we look at someone training out of the glute lab, they might be training glutes 4 days per week, but one of those days we're doing a bunch of things like weird banded lateral walks and we're doing these cable kickbacks with like virtually no load. And these really aren't great exercises for glutes, but we're specializing, we need to perform more work. So but we can only recover from so much. So we're just adding these in on another day and hoping it does the trick. So what are your thoughts? If we specialize, is there really a benefit to adding in more of this uh, low demanding work?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I always thought that stuff that they did kind of looked goofy, honestly. I mean, I'm sure that Brett is the man. Like he's the glute guy. He knows what he's doing. So he obviously must see some benefit in that. From what I've read, from what I've seen, doing banded monster walks and banded kickbacks where you're not actually approaching what would be considered effective reps. I mean, you could be doing 40, 50 of those things and still be able to do 30 or 40 more. The burn is gnarly, but that doesn't necessarily equate to there being like the tension that you're looking for with close proximity to failure. So I probably, before I can speak to like actually incorporating those, like I wouldn't incorporate those into my program until I was able to speak to someone like Brett and kind of understand his rationalization for how it's being implemented and why. I think for me, the way that I would design it probably would have some sort of undulating rep pattern. I think that 3 times a week would probably be the maximum that I would program it. There would probably be one day. I mean, the volume for lunges or split squats, as you mentioned, would have to start so low, like 1 set and maybe 2 sets. But I think that you put those on the day where you have the most rest coming after. So, maybe on a Monday you do a lunge or a split squat pattern, and then you do a concentric dominated movement, like maybe some sort of banded hip thrust of sorts with a barbell. So maybe you're banding it so that there's an increased tension at the top, but you're not getting as much eccentric loading at the bottom. Something along those lines. And then you have a longer rest period there. So maybe you have like 2 days off. And then on the Thursday, you maybe do some sort of hip hinge or something like that, where it's more going to be hamstring dominant than it is going to be glute dominant, because those glutes could still absolutely be sore from the lunges or split squats that you did on Monday. And then on that day, I think you also do, again, some more like kind of low fatigue stuff, like some lying leg curls. Depending on low back fatigue from the hip hinge movement, you could maybe do some like back extensions, hip extensions. You could definitely add in some things like some frog pumps or some like, weighted but higher rep glute work. And then I think that the goal there would just be make sure that you don't cause so much damage that you can't come back 2 days later on Saturday and do what I would consider to probably be your like eating workout of the week, where the reps are probably higher. You are doing more cable movements. Maybe you have some stuff that I wouldn't say is like that I called goofy, but maybe something like, a cable pull through, like emulating like a Russian kettlebell swing type movement, where you can work 25 rep relatively close proximity to failure. You can also do more hip thrusts on that day. And I can't remember if I mentioned leg curls, but I feel like you should at least have some form of leg curls in there twice a week, at least maybe one lying and one seated or one kneeling with the standing position.
Awesome. I think as we round out this question, just to kind of sum things up, is that if you do want to specialize a body part, it's probably worthwhile to decrease your volume for other muscle groups in order to increase the amount of work you can do for the muscle group you're trying to specialize, rather than keeping volume the same overall and then just increasing frequency or volume by adding a bunch of, to put it bluntly, bullshit movements that probably won't do much for increasing your glute growth. And then additionally, as we've mentioned, it's going to be a good idea to start things out slow and gradually build up, especially if you are adding in an extra day of glute or hamstring work, considering that the best exercises for this muscle group can be pretty disrupting, can result in some significant delayed onset muscle soreness. Bryan, anything to add there before we move on, man?
No, I think you covered it. I think the fatiguing, like the exercise order throughout the week is definitely going to be important to alleviate kind of that muscle damage. Yeah, I think you hit on that pretty well.
Cool. You want to bring us into question number 2?
Yeah, question number 2. Ooh, this is a big one too. How do you go about determining optimal volume load for clients? If I want to know what the MAV is for each of my muscle groups, how might I go about constructing my program to determine this?
So, as we unpack this question, I actually didn't really notice this when I first looked at it, but I want to address that they refer to volume load, which would be basically the number of sets times the number of reps times the amount of weight used. But I don't think that's really what we should be concerned with here. And further, I don't think that's really what this person is referring to. So for this question, we're going to be sticking to hard sets per week. So how do you know how many hard sets per week you should be doing? To be honest, off the top of my head, I don't think there's a great way to go about figuring out this answer besides just looking at your training log, assessing how many sets you're doing right now, how your progress has been as of late, and then figuring out from there, maybe increasing sets or decreasing sets based on your findings, and then seeing how progress goes from there. What I will say is how I don't think you should go about finding your MAV is running a mesocycle progressing from MEV to MRV. Or more specifically, I don't think you should proactively ramp sets across a training block to find out where your MAV is. For example, if we take the stereotypical, going from 10 to 20 sets, I don't think you can finish cycle and then if you progressed well, look at it and go, okay, well, my MEV should be in the middle then. It's 15. I think there's a lot of noise in that system that prevents you from making that conclusion. And I think based on the current popularity of this model, I think many of our listeners might hear this question and think, Well, that's exactly how I would go about it. I would just keep increasing sets, see where my progress at the end of the mesocycle, and then I would just jump to the middle. I really don't think that's how you should go about it. I think we should first be looking at your current progress, how many sets are you doing in this training block, what is your rate of progress, and then also if we consider where you're at in your training career and what is a realistic amount of progress. So if we look at an advanced lifter, the population that we're probably most interested in here, you're not going to be making that much progress. At least you shouldn't be. If you're objectively advanced, we're probably over the course of a 4 to 8 week mesocycle on those main movements. If there's something that I've been in the program for a while, we're looking at very small increases in performance, most likely something in the realm of adding 5 to 10 pounds, maybe a couple reps here or there by the end of an entire training block. So with that being said, if we look at your training history and we have a movement that you've had in for quite some time and you're an objectively advanced lifter, you've been at this for a while, you've been following well-structured scientific training principles for a few years, and we look at the end of a block and you've added 30 pounds to a lift that is not a new exercise and it's something like a barbell squat or barbell incline press, I would say you're probably training below your MAV, because in regard to this fitness fatigue model, when it comes to hypertrophic adaptations, we can always just ramp down our training volume, dissipate a bunch of fatigue, and then be able to maximally express strength. But that sort of training doesn't provide the amount of tension, the amount of exposure to that tension stimulus, which is necessary to drive hypertrophic adaptations. So I think it's really important to look at your progress and see what's going on. If you're advanced, or even if you're an intermediate and you want a whole block and you made no progress whatsoever, then it's time to look at your recovery. How are you feeling? If you feel beat up, maybe decrease a few sets and see how your performance is next mesocycle. If you feel fine, you haven't made any progress, add a couple of sets. But again, I think looking at a realistic rate of progress, which for a beginner might be adding 5 pounds, a couple of reps every week. For an intermediate, we might be looking at, pretty significant increase over a 4 to 8 week training block, maybe in the realms of adding, I don't know, 15, 25 pounds, depending on the lift. And we consider advanced, what's a realistic rate of progress there, which I already touched on. If we look at those things and then we assess our recovery, we can kind of go through this process of trial and error to really determine what your maximal adaptive volume is. And then it's also worth mentioning that your maximal adaptive volume, it's going to change over time. Again, depending on what's going on with stress outside of the gym, how much you can recover from, and even in general, it might just be a range, right? It could be something like 12 to 16 sets, and whether you perform 12 or you perform 16, you're going to make a similar amount of progress. Bryan, anything to add there? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you summed up a lot of what I was going to say too. I think that the difficulty that I have in like even thinking about addressing this question is that, using performance as a metric for hypertrophy or for even discovering what your optimal set volume is, number of hard sets, I think that just creates it becomes difficult. Like even looking at a person and being like, okay, you added 30 pounds to your back squat, you probably need more volume because you shouldn't be increasing strength that quickly. So then then they add more volume and say they did it over again, right? It's where you're comparing twins against each other. One person does less volume and gets 30 pounds, and another person does a little bit more volume but only increases their back squat 10, 15 pounds, something like that. Do we then immediately look at that person that increased it less and think that they are at their optimal volume because they didn't get as strong as the other person? So that kind of question is turning in my brain, and I don't exactly know the answer to that. So I propose potentially a model in which set volume, set number of hard sets is controlled for a mesocycle, more or less. You go deload intro week, and then you kind of keep it relatively static. And then you can increase sets potentially for the next mesocycle, and then potentially for the next mesocycle. So it's not exactly I don't think it's a perfect model, but I think that if you start at 10 sets and you do 4 weeks at 10 sets and you increase a bunch of strength and you feel good and recovered subjectively, like you said, then I think going to 12 isn't a terrible idea. And then if the same thing happens there, then I don't think going to 14 is a terrible idea. I just don't know exactly at what point, like, if say you get to 16 sets and then you don't gain any strength, are you then like, oh wow, okay, that's definitely over my optimal hard number of hard sets because I didn't gain strength this mesocycle. So then maybe you go back down to 14 and then you gain a little bit of strength, and now suddenly, like 16 weeks later, you finally have an idea that maybe 14 is the right number.
Yeah, a really good point there. In regards to the latter half of that statement, I think that, if we are at the 16 set mark and you didn't make any progress at block, it might be worthwhile to deload and then see where your strength is at in week 1, right? So then if we let that fatigue dissipate and then you're strongest ever in that initial week, that could be a sign that basically you were just, I guess, training sufficiently hard, right? Because, fatigue was masking fitness. But in the end, when we let that fatigue dissipate, there were improvements. Overall, I really like that model that you outlined. I think that could be, if we were to set up an objective way to be able to assess MAV outside of just looking at our training logs, I think that would be a really good way to go about it. I've posed similar questions about this model to other guests on the podcast, and I more or less posed it as, would this be a good model just to optimize muscle hypertrophy, as opposed to this popular method of proactively increasing sets on a weekly basis? Highly speculative. Even with that being said, I wouldn't say any of my guests were particularly fond of it or thought that it would be that great. But if we are really concerned about finding our MAV, and I don't know, for some odd reason, we just don't have the training logs to help make that decision, then I think that would be a fantastic way to go about it.
What do you think about using subjective measures potentially on a session to session or week to week basis? Some of the stuff that Mike talks about, like, I got sore from this workout, or I didn't get sore, or how sore I got, and then I got a pump, or I didn't really get a pump. I felt fatigue, walking up the stairs. I think at least when it comes to fatigue, walking up the stairs after a leg day, like that's kind of an expectation. I think that if you don't have that at some level, then you probably didn't work hard enough. But maybe more along the lines of like whether you have mild soreness the next day, whether you don't, whether that matters, and same with whether you get a pump session and whether that should impact on the way that you may adjust volume going forward.
I think the whole notion of having a pump is pretty convoluted, and anecdotally, for me at least, I think it's really hard to determine the efficacy of having a pump in a session, because like I literally do 1 set of bicep curls and I have like a crazy pump. I don't know if that's just me or what, but I've always just like been able to do like one working 7 exercise and just have like a crazy pump, and that's basically for like every muscle group. And then also we have to consider nutrition, right? So like, did you have more carbs that day? Was fluid and sodium on point? And it's like, was it the exercises, or was it your nutrition that was the result of having a pump? I think there might be something to the pump dissipating in a session, though. I think if like after 6 sets and then you go for the 7th set and like you feel your pump getting worse, it's probably time to wrap it up for that muscle group. I think there's probably not much of a benefit there. But as far as getting a pump in a session, I'm not sure if that's exactly conducive to the process of muscle hypertrophy. I know there's some literature showing, the relationship between cell swelling and perhaps some sort of signaling that could be causative of muscle growth. But I think if you're doing a sufficient amount of hard sets in the session, which is probably like at least 3, I'm not too concerned about having a pump per se, as long as the exercise fits the individual relatively well. Again, because there are other factors that can affect that. But yeah, if you feel that pump dissipating, you're probably over the point of effective volume for that session, and it might be better to leave that work for another time point. Soreness is tough too, man, right? Because it's like, again, I could do two sets of lunges after not doing them for a while, and I would get beat to hell. But I can guarantee that I didn't grow much muscle. And we also have that Damas paper showing that, the subjects who were insanely sore in the first week of training, how it didn't produce any muscle growth, and you're basically using all of your resources to repair that excessive damage, rather than grow new tissue. But then also, if you're never getting sore, let me rephrase that. If you never feel fatigued after your sessions, as you mentioned, if you never feel like it's kind of hard to walk up a flight of stairs after a leg day, I don't know, man. There's probably something not right about your training. At the gym I'm currently working out at, there is a steep flight of stairs going into the gym. So after a leg day, it's a burden to get up those stairs. And if it doesn't feel like a burden immediately after my leg training to get up those stairs, probably didn't work hard enough, or it was a deload session or an intro week. But yeah, definitely you don't need to be beat to hell after every session, and I think we can both agree on that.
Yeah, for sure. I find it interesting both with the pump and the soreness, because I also can get a pump from basically one set of any exercise that I do, and I've even commented how I feel like I have like that sensation. I don't know if hamstrings necessarily get a pump, but that like sensation of hamstrings being worked from my warm up sets of stiff legged deadlifts, and same thing, like, when it comes to chest and biceps, I do feel like, one set gives me a pump, and then it doesn't get any bigger after that, really. Like, it's not like I do set 2 and set 3 and I'm like, oh my God, it's like the most amazing pump I've ever had. It's just kind of like the same as it was after one set. So, that makes me wonder if, do I just need to do 1 or 2 sets, or really, like, am I benefiting? Is there enough additional benefit and stimulus from doing sets 3 and 4 that it warrants the extra fatigue costs? So I'm still kind of working through that in my training too. But like, regarding soreness, dude, my lats never get sore, like, ever. And the easy thing to say is like, oh, you don't know how to connect with your lats. I promise you, I do. Like, I absolutely know how to connect with my lats, and they just don't get sore. So, I think back is a slow twitch muscle for me, which is definitely a consideration. But I always do find that odd, and the only thing that ever gets my lats sore is just going in and doing pull-ups until I can't do a set of 5 anymore, and that's not really productive training. So I don't know that would be like the thing that I should do just to get my lats sore. I mean, I think I'm making progress and I'm improving performance without them getting sore, so I find it irrelevant.
Yeah, absolutely. In regard to the pump, I think if we use that to determine our minimum effective volume, it can be troublesome, and based on what we've both highlighted about our own experiences, I think it's provides a good reason as to why like, it might not be a good idea to use the pump as determining your MEV, because for both of us, I don't know, at least me, I wouldn't say that one set of an exercise for a muscle group is my minimum effective volume. I don't think I'll get better from that.
Mm-hmm.
But from what I've heard, when it comes to determining your MEV for a muscle group, it's just doing like a sufficient amount of work to get a pump. Is that what you've heard of as well?
Yeah, I believe that that's the criteria that RP uses, like on their little chart. It's like, if you got a pump, then that's your MEV. A pump plus mild soreness, which is easy to get because you're coming off like basically a deload week, where they're basically so far below, 5 or 6 RIR that I think it's basically like a week off. So yeah, I think it's easy to get sore, and I think it's, if you know how to get a pump, then it's easy to get a pump. So yeah, I mean, subjectively, I agree that I don't think one set is my MEV, but following that model, that would be kind of the intuitive analysis of it.
Yeah, so I don't love either of those points. I think looking at, performance and your rate of progress would probably be a little bit better to determine, what is the minimum amount of volume I need to make the minimal amount of progress. But then also, like, I don't know, I'm just not interested in MEV. Like, why do we want to make the smallest amount of progress possible? Why are we
Right.
concerned with finding this? And the only reason you would be concerned with it is if you're following this RP model of proactively increasing sets from week to week, which I don't really think you should be doing anyway. I think you should be doing the optimal amount of volume all the time.
Yeah, totally. I mean, following that logic too, I could go into a maintenance phase where I'm doing 6 sets per muscle group per week, and I could still get a pump and get sore. And so I don't know, man. It seems like effective training to me.
Exactly. And that amount of volume is maintenance, yet you're checking these boxes. So yeah, I think we need to lean on, what the literature is saying as far as, the number of hard sets per muscle group, which should be sufficient. And then, using the logbook, using trial and error. Going back to what you said about your lats and whether they get sore or not, from myself and basically all of my clients, for the most part, I've noticed that basically like everyone can tolerate a fair bit of back work in regard to volume. It just seems to be typically something that can handle getting beat up quite a bit in regard to, hard sets per week and frequency.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, in my program right now, I have 16 sets of direct back work. That's either a horizontal pull or a vertical pull. But then I also have like endless amount of, not endless, but I have a decent amount of like face pulls and rear delt work and stuff like that. And I know for sure that like low traps and rhomboids and stuff like that are also going to be hit relatively significantly from doing face pulls and stuff. So at least my upper back is getting a ton of volume. And maybe there is opportunity here to add in some more isolated lat volume, like maybe doing some straight arm pull downs once a week for 2 sets, something like that would be a good experiment to add in, since my lats aren't getting sore and they do seem to be recovering. But talk for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think these are all some really interesting points that will give the listeners a lot to think about with their own training. Moving on to our third question, Bryan. Why is it so important to have consistent movement selection in programming? And if you vary movements, what is the decision-making process for adjusting movement selection?
It's an interesting question. Okay, so the first part is we've kind of even covered or alluded to, in that it's important to have consistent movement selection, because if you're constantly changing movements, then you have constant neural learning occurring, and the progress that you're making is sort of a facade. And it's not very trackable, it's not very accurate, and you can't use it as any sort of data point to determine if you're actually progressing. So that would kind of be the reason for consistent movement selection. Regarding kind of why we would change movements, I think there's a number of different ways that this could happen. Just looking at my last 2 mesocycles, I had an overhead tricep extension cause me elbow pain with a barbell, so I had to switch to a cable. I would say that with that as like the basis, joint fatigue or connective tissue or issues is probably going to be the number one reason that you would exchange exercises. I've done that of different mesocycles, and it's been always with an isolation movement, or it's been a grip modification, like going from a pronated grip pull up into.
Could you restate that real quick? You lagged for a second there.
Sorry, what did you hear last?
Over the last 2 mesocycles or so.
Yeah, over the last 2 mesocycles, I've changed. That's been the primary reason for changing things, is joint fatigue and connective tissue. So it's been a grip position potentially. Like I changed from a pronated pull up to a neutral rotational handle pull up, because the inside of my left elbow was giving me a little bit of issue, and then it was the same elbow on the other side that was affecting me on the overhead barbell tricep extension. So switching that tricep extension to a cable and switching the hand grip on the pull up, and I'm 2 weeks into those changes and the pain is completely gone. So that's a great way that somebody would implement changes while trying to keep the stimulus as close as possible, right? So the thing that I always tell people is, if they're like, squats are bothering my knees. Can I go to leg extensions or something like that? And I think that for your listeners, that's going to be a very obvious one where it's one is not the same as the other. But I think that even going into like more isolated movements, like looking at something like a hack squat into like a sissy squat or something like that. Again, you're having a movement where the hip is helping to extend the quad versus in the sissy squat, the quad is kind of extending in absence of the hip. So I think that you want to make sure when you're changing movements out that you're exchanging movement pattern for movement pattern. Like a sissy would equal a leg extension, where a hack squat would equal some sort of modification of a bilateral squat pattern extension. And then let me see what else. There was another reason. I think that staleness or lack of progress is definitely a viable reason to change a movement. However, I'm not super fast to jump on that one because I'd like to see a number of weeks in a row of a movement stalling. I also don't have a huge problem if people want to exchange out isolation, cable style movements, mesocycle to mesocycle. I mean, I don't think that it's necessarily optimal, and it does blur data. But when we look at the broader picture of adherence and enjoyment of the program being important, that if I can get someone to keep A and B the same, and they're always doing the same compounds for a number of mesos in a row, and it really helps them to have different curls and tricep extensions and raises each meso, then I am okay with that.
I agree. I think your first point is just, yeah, that's exactly right. Why don't we change movements frequently? It's because then you're just relearning movements all the time, and your rate of progress is more or less neuromuscular adaptations and have nothing to do with increases in cross-sectional area, which are potentiating increases in force production. When it comes time to switch movements out, when it comes to hypertrophy training, I agree. It's probably, if something doesn't feel right, if it's causing some sort of connective tissue degradation, then it's probably a good time to swap that exercise out. I think I kind of made a recent post on this, and we had an exchange about basically boring training.
Yep.
And I think it's an interesting discussion because since hypertrophy is such a forgiving adaptation, we can basically justify changing up our training all of the time because we can always provide the rationale. Well, load on the bar and everything else, these are just proxies for what we're really after, which is applying a sufficient level of tension at the muscle fiber level. So as long as we're working hard, does it even really matter, if load on the bar is going up? As long as we're applying a reasonable level of effort, won't those muscle fibers be experiencing significant tension and they'll grow? And I think that's fair, but we need to be able to somehow objectively assess this very nebulous goal of muscle hypertrophy, which has no specific training per se, which facilitates this adaptation. There's so many different avenues to take. When it comes to training, this really allows us to assess whether or not our muscles are growing in perhaps the most objective way possible, outside of, getting a DEXA done every 3 months. And even then, a DEXA is going to have some measurement error, especially depending on things like hydration status. So if we're looking at training performance, and it might be a good idea to do boring training, I've run into this issue numerous times where, a movement will stall for a month or two, and I'll just swap it out. And I don't think that's the right approach. I think you should be grasping on to these bread and butter movements with as much as you can. Your first idea when a movement stalls probably shouldn't be to just throw something else in. I think it should be, how can I adjust the amount of work I'm performing per session? How can I adjust my frequency? How can I adjust these factors to spur new progress? Because we can always just reset movements and then make quick gains because of neurological adaptations. And it gets really boring trying to add one rep for a 4-week mesocycle. But man, you can be damn sure that that one rep is probably a good indicator that some muscle growth occurred, whereas adding 20 pounds over 4 weeks to a new lift, probably nothing interesting happened there, which brings up another point about, how frequently should we be swapping out our isolation movements. And because there's a very low skill demand on these exercises, you can probably use a new one each week, right? And be perfectly fine. But on the other side of the coin, you could be absolutely sure that any performance increases on an isolation movement are probably a product of increase in cross-sectional area. And then for that reason, I would like to keep these consistent because they are our most objective and practical marker that progress is occurring in terms of physique development. What are your thoughts there?
Dude, that's such a good point. I appreciate that you brought that up, and that you kind of re-referenced our conversation the other day about boring training, because my response to that was all about personal preference and adherence, and you were like, I don't really care about that. Like, of course, personal preference and adherence matters. And I think that your idea is actually quite good. For anyone that didn't see it, it was basically spending an entire, is it a mesocycle or a macrocycle, on a specific
Meso.
rep scheme? A meso, yeah. So an entire a mesocycle on a specific rep scheme, and then using reps as variance, so that the next mesocycle was a different rep scheme, and then the next mesocycle after that was a different rep scheme. I would say now that this just came to my head, though, that also does create a little bit of issue with diagnostics. If you're changing rep schemes, even if you're keeping the same movements, you probably have some neural adaptation to yeah. Go ahead.
Let me provide a rebuttal to that real quick.
Yeah.
So I think that this boring training could be more fun. And let me tell you why. So over this macro cycle, you are you are adjusting your rep range, but you're keeping the movement constant. So you might have a 12-week macro cycle. You might hit a movement for, sets of 10 to 15 in this block, and then 8 to 12 in the next, and then 6 to 10. And you're keeping that movement the same. And the reason why I think this could be more fun for an advanced lifter is because progress is super slow, and significant progress will probably only occur every macro cycle or so. So for that reason, you could, just use some sort of daily undulating approach, train a movement twice per week. On one day, do 10 to 12, and on the other day, do 6 to 8. And then you could just bang your head against the wall for 12 weeks doing those exclusive rep ranges. And then maybe you see at the end of 12 weeks that you added, 5 pounds here or a couple of reps there. But I think that's super boring. And if we look at realistic rates of progress, basically it could be interesting because you're only using a specific rep range for each mesocycle, and you should only progress every macrocycle or so. So by the time you go past 10 weeks and get back to that rep range, that might be the amount of time it takes to actually see those 5-pound increases, where if you were just keeping those rep ranges stagnant and just alternating within the week, you might just be performing the same reps with the same load week after week, waiting for that adaptation to surface, and it just feels extremely nebulous and nothing is going on, when really that's just how long it takes you to progress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think that I think it does actually sound fun, to be honest. I'm kind of imagining myself going through this, and I'm like, oh, so I get to do lower reps every week, and it's like typical linear periodization, but instead of implemented on a weekly basis over the course of a mesocycle, it's over the course of a macrocycle with mesocycle and mesocycle adjustments. I like the idea a lot. I think it could definitely work. I think my point going into it was the diagnostic side of, you're spending this amount of time, in a more muscular endurance oriented rep range, and then you're dropping to 8 to 12, which still has components of that, but also is lower and has maybe some neural adaptation to heavier weights. And then you go into 5 to 8s or whatever that is, and now you really have a lot of kind of neural adaptations to heavier weights. So I think that it still kind of could impact diagnostics on a kind of week to week, mesocycle to mesocycle basis. But over the course of a macrocycle, if you were to come back to that after 12 to 15 weeks, I think that it gives you a really, really good diagnostic tool. Given that you're talking to an advanced athlete, I think it makes sense because you're not actually going to see those increases week to week anyways. But if that was something that, the whole side of keeping RIR static and keeping volume static week to week is so that week to week you can see whether with everything static, you are increasing or not. So I don't know. I mean, I think that, like we were discussing online, I think you got to take it for a test run and document the whole thing and let us follow along.
Yeah, I definitely will, man. And I'm in the process of the first mesocycle of this 3 mesocycle macro cycle. Um, with that being said, I think it probably is something that's like only advantageous to the advanced lifter, because if you are a beginner or an intermediate, you should be seeing these increases in performance on a relatively short-term basis. So you don't really need to, consider long-term structure that much. Whereas for an advanced athlete where you're only seeing performance improvements on such a long time scale anyway, then it could be useful for this sort of planning.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree. And it actually intrigues me too. So I'm really excited to follow your journey. And then one other point I wanted to make, just back on one of the things that you said about, because hypertrophy is such a forgiving stimulus that you really could just go in and do fuck all any day. And like, you're just providing tension to the muscle, right? But I think that that goes back to what you mentioned. I think it was the Damas study where the people that got really sore didn't actually make any progress while they were sore. So if you're constantly switching movements out and you're kind of chasing this feeling of soreness as like an identifier that you put enough tension on the muscle and you had a quality session, and these factors that come along with new movements, you could be theoretically stunting your progress a little bit.
Yeah, man, I agree with that. This was actually a notion put forth by my conversation with John Meadows. He said that him and Dr. Scott Stevenson have talked about this, and that they thought for advanced athletes, they could just go in and do whatever felt great that day, apply a high level of effort, get in, get out. And he was like, you put tension on the muscle. And then for your point, he kind of, put forward that, well, for an advanced lifter, they're pretty skilled in a variety of movement patterns, so there shouldn't be too much in regard to neuromuscular adaptations. Whereas a beginner, it might take 8 weeks for a squatting pattern to really lock those in, whereas for an advanced person it might just take a couple of sessions. But still, the idea makes me uncomfortable. Maybe if you've been in the game for 20 plus years, and it doesn't really matter what you do anyway. Your potential for growth is so small. But if you have something to gain, if you're still competing, and you have a 3-year off season that you need to make the most of, I definitely would not advise that sort of loosey-goosey approach.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure that John Meadows could do 2 sets of lunges and also get really, really sore for 5 days too. So I don't know, maybe, soreness doesn't necessarily correlate to muscle damage. So that Damas study, I think, was looking at muscle damage, and soreness was a byproduct of that. But fuck, man, John Meadows may do 2 sets of lunges and be sore for 5 days, but not really have much muscle damage.
Yeah, for sure. You want to take us into our next question, which could be your last? We'll see.
Yeah. How might someone alter the execution of their movement if the goal is performance or strength as opposed to strictly hypertrophy, and to create the most optimal stimulus to a specific muscle?
This is a good question. I don't think it's too complicated, but we'll see. We'll see how we get into this. So, my original passion was in bodybuilding. It has returned to bodybuilding, but for about a 2-year period, I was all into powerlifting, and the way I perform the same movement significantly differs depending on whether I'm focused on powerlifting or performance slash strength metrics in comparison to muscle hypertrophy. When I'm training for muscle hypertrophy, the tempo of the lift is much more controlled. The eccentric is a bit longer, and almost dogmatically, I would say I apply pauses at both the top end of the range and the bottom. So for a squat, I am always more or less pausing in the hole. For a bench or some sort of press, I'm basically always pausing the bar on my chest. For back movements, pausing at the top. For calf raises, long pause in the bottom, nice pause at the top. Whereas when I'm powerlifting, My eccentrics were a bit more rapid. If we're going to refer to the squat, because you do have to pause a bench press in powerlifting, if we refer to the squat, you don't want to dive bomb into the hole per se, because you might, be losing tension, which would compromise your ability to produce force coming out of the hole. But you're probably going to use some sort of more rapid eccentric compared to a bodybuilder, because there is a stretch reflex coming out of that bottom. We want to take advantage of that elastic energy to bump us up out of the hole. And again, that is this is elastic energy. This isn't the muscle doing work. Whereas, if you're squatting for bodybuilding, for physique purposes, you want to make sure the muscle is performing the most amount of work possible. You want to make sure that you're not relying on connective tissues to supply some of the force, or anything else. So removing that stretch reflex by pausing in the hole, forcing the quads to do all of the work to come out, that would be conducive for bodybuilding. I would say that more or less describes the main differences. We're going to be controlling the movement a bit more, slower eccentric, utilizing pauses. We're just making sure that the muscles are doing the most amount of work possible, in comparison to, again, load on the bar is a proxy, right? So it really doesn't matter if you're squatting 225 or 275. If 275 is a rapid eccentric and you're bouncing out of the hole, and perhaps you're only squatting to parallel, as opposed to 225 where you're using a slow eccentric, you're pausing in the bottom, you're going ass to grass, the muscle is probably doing more work in the latter example, and that's what we're after when it comes to muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah, I think you made a bunch of really good points. You took a lot of what I was going to say, but I have two things left to add to that. So I think the statement of muscle is a dumb piece of meat and it really only knows tension is important here. And I constantly find myself telling people that you could literally go, like if your goal is hypertrophy, you could go from squatting 225 to 230 for the same amount of reps, and you could get a worse stimulus to your quads with 230 than you did with 225. And then you could, have completed the movement. So then you go up to 235 and then you go up to 240 and you're completing these movements, but your quads are doing less and less work over time. So I think that, standardizing movement, like you said, is important. I also want to make the point about RIR, or reps in reserve, and that in powerlifting, it literally is moving a weight from point A to point B. So using two movements where I think RIR is somewhat obvious difference between the two endeavors are the squat and any sort of hip hinge, an RDL or a stiff leg deadlift. It's very obvious in a squat when you're no longer working through your quads, because the butt shoots up, the torso hinges forward, the butt shoots back, and everything shifts into the posterior chain. So I think that, gauging an RIR in a strength pursuit is literally the moment that you feel like you're 2 reps away from not being able to sit down and stand up with a full range of motion is your RIR. It becomes quite ambiguous in the pursuit of hypertrophy, at least initially, before you become, a veteran or super advanced and have really good body awareness, because it's not even like it happens immediately or in one rep. Like I could be going and I'm at 5 reps of pause, high bar back squats and everything's great. And then 6 reps and everything's great, but it's like hard to fight through that position. And then rep 7, I like kind of get stuck. Instead of continuing to fight and shift my hips under my torso, I kind of shift my hip back and the chest comes up and I'm like, oh, that was a fast rep. Let me do another one because that one was even faster than the one prior. So tension is shifting and the whole game of gauging your RIR becomes very complex. And you and I even, broached this discussion on social media the other day where we were talking about my SLDL and my RDL and how I was saying that, I feel like I'm doing these reps and they all look the same, like even to the camera, rep 1 to rep 7 is identical. I feel this shift occurring where my hamstrings are doing less work and my erectors and glutes, maybe upper glutes, are taking away a little bit more of that work, rep to rep to rep. So what might be like 7 RIR for the movement actually, a 2 RIR for my hamstrings. So I think kind of getting into the nitty gritty of that and how that impacts the way that you execute and perform reps is important. And then all of that just circles right back to all the stuff you said about, standardizing movement through pauses and stretch position and the contracted position, controlled eccentrics. And I'll add to that being able to feel the muscle lengthen as you lower the weight is kind of a nuanced skill that I think a lot of people don't actually have. Like, just because you're doing a dumbbell bench press and you touch your chest with the weight and then you come back up again, that doesn't mean that you're actively like feeling those chest muscles stretch and load as it comes back, and then feeling that kind of rubber band effect out of the bottom. So I think the movement could look the same to an outside eye, but the way that it feels to the person performing the movement is very different.
Yeah, I like your point on the mind muscle connection there, which I think there's a lot of merit there. I mean, we're just starting to get, some decent research on the topic showing that it is efficacious. If you look at the work from Brad Schoenfeld, this was part of the bro lore for a while, and it didn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if you feel a squat in your quads. The quads work in the squat. So as long as the weight's going up, you're going to get big legs. But that's not necessarily the truth. As you mentioned, there are a lot of things going on potentially at the hip joint, which can significantly remove the tension from the quads. And for that reason, I do think it is extremely important, if your goal is enhancing your physique, to make sure that the exercise that you are performing, you are feeling the targeted muscle working. You mentioned there the role of active range of motion, right? So this is the range of motion that you can control, that the muscle is under tension the entire time. The weight isn't just moving. I think we can dive into the realm of anecdote when it comes to the importance of the mind muscle connection. If we look at powerlifters compared to bodybuilders on average, and now I'm making an extreme generality here, and there are many exceptions, but in most cases, if you look at 180-pound bodybuilder and 180-pound powerlifter, the bodybuilder is going to have a much more impressive physique, but the powerlifter is going to be a heck of a lot stronger. And what's the difference there? Well, the powerlifter is just moving weight A to B. It doesn't matter what muscles are working as long as they get the weight moving. Whereas a bodybuilder is going to make sure that every inch of that range of motion is specific, it is filled with intent, and that the targeted musculature is being worked. Even if we apply this to the general population, go to your local gym, look around at the variety of ways people think it's okay to perform a dumbbell curl. It's fascinating to watch all the different ways that someone can perform a dumbbell curl. If you ask 8 out of 10 people doing a dumbbell curl, they couldn't tell you whether their quads are working or their biceps are working. And these people usually don't have very impressive physiques. They look the same year after year. There's no intent, there's no purpose behind the movements that they're doing. And I think all of this helps explain that there's probably something to the mind muscle connection. And sure, everything kind of operates on a bell curve, right? And if you focus too much on the mind muscle connection, then you have people who are basically never getting strong because they add 5 pounds and they lose focus on the muscle, and they're just pump jockeys who everything they do is lightweight, and they're just trying to feel the muscle, and they have no concept of progression. But if you control for these things, you're standardizing your training, you're looking at progress over time. I think whether or not you're feeling a muscle is extremely valuable.
Yeah, I 100% agree, man. I come from a long background of different training modalities, starting with, kind of hit, like not Mike Mentzer style hit, but 2 to 3 days a week, full body sessions, compound movements only. Moved into some 5x5 stuff, did max OT, did the bro split stuff, did CrossFit, and came out of it, in 2015, 2016 into this kind of evidence-based space. And throughout all those prior, 18 years of training before 2016, I never really knew how to lift a mind muscle connection. It was always like, even during bro split days and stuff, it never was anything I focused on. Like, we were in college and we were just trying to bench press and squat as much as we could and show off. And shit, it worked. But I'll tell you what, man, after 18 years of training, I have made better progress these last 4 to 5 years than I did for many years after my initial newbie gains. So I'd 100% say that there's something to it. And there's also absolutely something to standardizing movement. And this is like kind of one of my big crusades now on my stories, is getting people to stand my audience in this space. And they don't standardize movements. They just move
Brian,
from point A to point
could
B.
you repeat that?
Sorry.
You said you were on a crusade on your Instagram story about standardizing movements, and then
Yeah, because a lot of ours come from a functional fitness space where it's really about moving for speed or moving point A to point B as quickly as possible. And performance gains are the way that they assess that things are working. But being able to standardize movement and incorporate mind muscle connection into that standardization, I think, is something that people honestly don't even know how much is going to benefit them, because aside from the hypertrophy and strength gains that will result from that, and the diagnostic tool that it provides, is it also like minimizes any sort of injury risk. I mean, the worst thing I've had happen to me in the last 5 years since training this way is occasional elbow tendonitis. And like, that's it. Like, in years of CrossFit and, training for performance, I was constantly beat up. I constantly had things that I was working around. So it's been a super breath of fresh air for me these last few years.
yeah, I think we can tie together a lot of these concepts here. Similarly, during my brief stint in powerlifting, basically at the end of every mesocycle, I was on the verge of just falling apart. I was dealing with some sort of tendonitis, whether it was my elbow or my knee, basically every other training block. I mean, I had a couple of competitions where I would come into my peaking block and I was just destroyed. Like, I really just could have benefited from like not lifting for a while, but it was just out of the question.
Yeah.
And the reason for this stems from the fact that, there you have heavier loads. You're not so much concerned about what's going on at each joint, what muscles are feeling tension, just moving it from point A to point B. Whereas, if you are incorporating these pauses, these slower eccentrics, these more controlled movements, that can be super productive from an injury prevention standpoint. And then also just not being tied down to 3 specific exercises can help. Movement variety is always going to reduce the potential of these monotonous training injuries.
Yeah, for sure, man. Agree with all of that. It's interesting coming from, or spending a decent chunk of my time in CrossFit, where it was just about how much volume you could do. Like, how good can you get at these movements? Because everything's a skill, right? So you look at these movements and you have to get better at muscle ups, better at thrusters, and better at all these different things. And the way you get better at things is by practicing them. It's not like foul shots practice. It's like really, really intense practice. And being able to come from that mindset of more is better, and then into this mindset where quality is better, and you're limited in how much you can do because the quality is so high. And I think that as a takeaway for anyone listening that thinks that more is always better, is, I would say that quality is better, and do the most that you can.
Couldn't agree more. Quality over quantity, that applies to so many different facets, whether that be the amount of training volume you're doing or just, the exercises in general. You mentioned the example earlier about how you can add 5 pounds to a lift, and the muscles experience less tension as a product of that. And that gets into these issues with the logbooks. Logbooks are essential for training. You need a way to assess your progress over time, but so many people get into trouble by trying to beat the logbook at all costs. And if you're compromising the tempo of your exercises, the range of motion, in order to complete more reps or more load, and your goal is hypertrophy, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. you're probably, and this is another reason why it's really important to, record your training, right? Because I think we all have good intentions, but at the end of the day, we're motivated, we're driven, we're competitive, we like to beat the logbook. And sometimes we just need that footage to hold us accountable to make sure that we're not cheating ourselves, because, we do have the right intention. It just, things happen.
Absolutely, man. Totally.
All right, Bryan, I think that will do it for today's discussion. We may or may not be doing a part 2. I will leave that up to the listeners. Guys, in the comments below, let us know. What did you think of Bryan? Would you like to have him back on the show? Did you like this format? Do you enjoy question and answers, or do you prefer the typical long duration interviews on a single topic? Bryan, for people who want to go and support you, where can you point them to?
Evolvedtrainingsystems.com. It's kind of my brand. We have a bunch of programs there. I do individual coaching through there too, and Paragon Training Methods, another company of mine. And you can find me on Instagram at my name, Bryan Boorstein.
Excellent. And those links will be in the show notes. But that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Hey guys, Mike here. If you're interested in learning more about how to maximize your health, body composition, and performance, head over to hammerawayfitness.com, where you can sign up for coaching or even just schedule an hour consult with me to get some of your training and nutrition questions answered. Also, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did and would like to further support the growth of the Muscle Memoirs podcast, you can give a donation to the link in the show notes, leave us a review, and or share this episode with your friends, whether that be dropping the link in a group chat or putting a screenshot in your Instagram story. I truly appreciate it.